Welcome back to CEEN Caribbean News. It's now time for Indepth. Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Keith Rowley, spent some time in Jamaica last week to address pressing issues which threatened the relationship between both countries. One of those issues was trade. A blaring trade imbalance between both countries, Jamaica on the shorter end of that equation, had resulted in calls for a ban on goods from Trinidad and Tobago. Jamaican business interests have also complained about barriers to trade facilitation. During his 5-day visit to the country, Dr. Rowley met with President of the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica, PSOJ, Mr. William Mafood, to iron out those issues and more. Mr. Mafood is our guest on this edition of Indepth to give us the 411 on those discussions. Welcome to Indepth, Mr. Mafood.
Thank you, and welcome to your to all of your customers and to listeners and viewers.
Thank you very much. Now, please help us to understand the trade disparity between Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. What are some of the barriers that Jamaica's manufacturers have been faced with exporting to Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, it's a combination of things. I mean, if you were to take all of the different areas, you have issues related to subsidies on energy, where Trinidad has a mechanism that they provide subsidized energy to their manufacturers, which in turn allows them to have lower cost of production. They have subsidies on their fuel. So fuel that they same manufacturers and producers in Trinidad use are also subsidized. In addition to that, we buy a lot of fuel from Trinidad in finished petroleum products like gas and diesel, etc. And they sell us that same fuel that they subsidize to the local market at a premium. And they can do this because of the CET, the Common External Tariff. Then you have issues related to movement of goods into Trinidad. Jamaica allows all of its CARICOM member states rail-free access to its markets. I mean, that's one of the things that, if anybody was to measure all of the region and its members by the rules, you would say Jamaica plays by the rules the most. But Trinidad, it is always a challenge to try and get access to their market. Now, the imbalance of trade, a large part of it, the very largest part of it, is really oil-based products, petroleum, things like the oils and lubricants, etc. So if you remove that, it still is a huge, huge imbalance. I mean, you're talking about somewhere close to $200 million a year. So we need, as a country, to identify, and this is one of the things in discussions with Prime Minister Rowley, that imbalance of trade means that there are going to be less jobs in Jamaica, and that's why we have such a high unemployment rate. And we, as a country, have to ask, within CARICOM, the intent of, a single market is that people should be able to move freely into those jobs in Trinidad or Guyana or wherever they may be because of the benefits that they have with low cost of energy.
Now, Dr. Rowley mentioned in his exit press conference that some of the barriers that were complained about by Jamaican manufacturers and exporters, they don't exist on the law books of Trinidad and Tobago. Has that been the experience of most of the members, or are these things...
No, it's not that they don't exist. It's just that that you have people in those positions, and it's a lot of it has to do with bureaucracy. And I will give it. It's not that it's the intent of the government of Trinidad and Tobago to block Jamaican goods from coming in, but a lot of the times what happens is you have issues with products going into Trinidad, and when they get there, the person who works at the equivalent of our Bureau of Standards, their agencies called their Food and Drug, they would say that, well, this product doesn't meet the standards of labeling in Trinidad. And yet they have the very same product being manufactured in Trinidad by Trinidadian manufacturers with the same exact labeling standards. So the problem is, if you have one set of standards for your local producers, those standards must be the same for the imports. And what is happening is, every time that there is a problem, it becomes a trade issue, and somebody, whether it's somebody here at the local, the Jamaica Exporters Association or the JMA, has to call their counterparts in Trinidad. It got to the point where they even set up a trade desk in Jamaica for manufacturers here trying to get access to Trinidad. So I think what we need to have is a real appreciation by the Trinidadian authorities that Jamaica is a compliant member state in CARICOM, and our manufacturers' products, if they're good enough for the local market, then they're supposed to be good enough for the Trinidadian market.
Would a Bureau of Standards of sorts across the entire region, perhaps one implemented by CARICOM, fix that issue?
Well, that is one of the things. There is something called CrossQ. I'm not 100% sure what it stands for, but it basically is a regional body that is supposed to identify a regional set of standards which would apply, labeling standards, product quality standards, etc., which would apply at a regional level. So everybody who manufactures, whether you're in Trinidad, Barbados, Guyana, or Jamaica, those products that you manufacture must comply with that standard, and once it complies with that standard, it would be fully accessible to the whole market.
Now, what are some of the agreements, the better trade facilitation between Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, arriving from your meeting with Dr. ROWLEY last Tuesday?
Well, I think it's a little premature. I think more importantly is the intent. I think Dr. ROWLEY came here. He was extremely open to resolving the issues that existed, and it's not just issues of trade. We have issues with immigration and the movement of Jamaicans into Trinidad. We spoke about that at length. I mean, there are certain things that were happening down there. I spoke with his Minister of Foreign Affairs and CARICOM Affairs and recommended that they should stop stamping Jamaicans' passport when they're denying them entry, because it can prejudice those same people if they want to go and apply for a visa at the U.S. High Commission or the British High Commission. And different little things like that, little simple things that I think would be viewed as measures to improve relations and improve the whole single market. One of the things I also recommended is that we should have a work permit program that allows manufacturers in Trinidad and service operators to, if they can't identify Trinidadian local people to fill their jobs and the vacancies, that they should be able to apply to a body here in Jamaica, whether the Ministry of Labor or some other ministry, that would then have a roll call of names that they could pull from, people who would be, not necessarily of the CARICOM standards and qualifications, but they would be able to go into services industry or work as a security guard or whatever it may be. Those are some of the things that I'm hoping in further discussions our government will try and identify as potential benefits.
Are you confident that Trinidad and Tobago will honor what has been agreed so far during the discussions with Jamaica?
I have to take the Prime Minister on his word. I feel that he came here with, as I said, extremely open and willing to listen and to resolve some of these issues. My view is that he intends to try and fix these things. If he goes back and nothing comes of it and it's just another, talk shop, then I think as a country we have to take a more aggressive stance.
Now, it has been reported that the trade deficit between Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago is close to $200 million US, Jamaica being on the losing end of that equation. Right. Now, is that figure likely to decrease in large amounts when these trade barriers are lifted?
To be honest with you, I think as a country we have a lot of retooling to do in our manufacturing sector. Our country primarily is going to grow not in manufacturing, but it is going to grow in areas of service, tourism, mining, agriculture to a lesser extent. And, those are the areas that we as a country are going to grow. So the manufacturing sector, which is really the goods sector that is going to need to build its base in order to reduce those trade deficits, is going to be challenging for a long time to come, because we still have to supply our local market. So what you've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of investment taking place in the manufacturing sector, but primarily for local consumption. So companies like Grace Kennedy, like Lasco, companies like Wisinco, Pepsi, True Juice, National Continental, all of these large manufacturing and consumer goods companies have been investing heavily in capital to create additional production to satisfy local demand, and which effectively displaces a lot of these imports. So it'll be some time, I think, before we can narrow that gap. What we need to start measuring is how much of that gap is in services, and what are the areas that Jamaica as a country can provide services to the region, in order to narrow that gap through services rather than in goods.
Now, some of the barriers to trade are believed to be homegrown. How can Jamaica help its manufacturers be more competitive throughout the region, especially when they have to compete with energy-rich nations?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think many of the issues that we do face, like the subsidized energy, etc., and subsidized fuel, are to some extent, we have to put at the feet and the blame of our leaders over the years. I mean, we have, as a country, we have allowed our governments, successive governments, not just this government, but all the previous governments, have allowed some of these practices to continue knowingly without taking a very firm action. And I think, it's only just in the last year and a half, with the continued call of some of these issues, where in the past, private sector had spoken about subsidies that were being given to the manufacturing sector in Trinidad on energy and fuel, and it fell on deaf ears. Now, I think as we have reached a stage where consumers now starting to say, we want to have a proper treatment of these issues, and consumers are starting to say, if we don't feel that these issues are being treated properly, then we're going to start boycotting Trinidadian goods. Then what you have is a situation where we finally get a response from the Trinidadians. And to some extent, I think the government now is finally realizing that this is a very, very political topic, a very hot topic. And the government also is now finally saying, well, let's address these issues. So our government has finally woken up and is now addressing these issues, because it's become a very political topic,
Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Mahfood.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
We've been in discussions with President of the PSOJ, William Mahfood, regarding the meeting he held with Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister last week.